Jane Eyre was written by Charlotte Bronte, an English writer from the 19th century who became famous for this book. First published in 1847, it's a story about a young girl named Jane Eyre who goes through a lot of tough times but grows up to be a strong and independent woman. Charlotte Bronte used her own life and imagination to create this tale, which is full of deep feelings and exciting moments that still touch people's hearts today. Part 1. Childhood in Gateshead. The story starts with Jane Eyre as a 10-year-old girl, an orphan because both her parents died when she was very young. After their death, her uncle, Mr. Reed, brought her to live with his family at Gateshead Hall, a big fancy house that could have been a happy place for a child. But it wasn't like that for Jane, since her uncle passed away soon after she arrived, leaving her with her aunt, Mrs. Reed, and her 3 cousins, John, Eliza, and Georgiana. Instead of finding love or kindness there, Jane faced a life where no one seemed to want her around, and every day felt heavy with loneliness. Living at Gateshead, Jane often felt unloved and out of place, as Mrs. Reed treated her with coldness and never showed her any care. Her cousins weren't much better, especially John, a 14-year-old boy who enjoyed making Jane's life miserable by bullying her whenever he got the chance. While Eliza and Georgiana didn't hit her like John did, they still hurt her by teasing her or pretending she didn't exist, which left Jane's heart aching just as much. Even though the house had beautiful rooms and tall windows, it was a sad and empty world for Jane, who had no friends to talk to or play with in that big, unwelcoming place. One chilly November day, something happened that showed how hard Jane's life really was. She was sitting by a window, hidden behind a red curtain, reading a book because it was one of the few things that brought her comfort and let her escape her troubles for a while. Suddenly, John found her and got angry, saying she had no right to touch his books, even though Jane had nothing else to keep her busy. When she tried to explain that she just wanted to read, he wouldn't listen and threw the book at her, hitting her head so hard that she fell and cut herself, with blood running down her face from the pain. For the first time, Jane couldn't hold back her anger, and because she was so tired of being treated badly, she shouted at John, calling him cruel and unfair. This made him furious, so he charged at her, and they started fighting, with Jane pushing back even though she was smaller and weaker. Their struggle was loud enough to bring Mrs. Reed and the servants running into the room. But when they saw Jane and John tangled up, Mrs. Reed didn't care who started it. She just grabbed Jane's arm and pulled her away, yelling, "You wicked girl!" Jane wanted to tell her side of the story, that John had hurt her first, but no one would listen, and they all saw her as the problem because she was just a poor orphan in their eyes. Then things took a turn for the worse, as Mrs. Reed decided to punish Jane in a way that filled her with dread. She told the servants, Bessie and Miss Abbott, to take Jane to the Red Room, a dark and quiet place where Mr. Reed had died years before, which the family rarely used because it felt so strange and cold. Jane begged them not to lock her in there, crying and shaking with fear, but Mrs. Reed ignored her pleas and said, "Take her." The servants dragged her upstairs, pushed her inside, and locked the door, leaving Jane alone in that frightening room with her heart beating fast. Inside the Red Room, everything was silent and shadowy, with a big bed covered in red curtains, a mirror, and a single chair that made the space feel heavy and spooky. As Jane looked around, scared and unsure, she remembered her uncle dying in that bed, and her imagination started to run wild, wondering if his ghost might still be there watching her. The wind howled outside, and as the light faded into night, the room grew darker, making Jane's fear grow until she couldn't stand it. When she walked to the mirror and saw her pale face staring back, she thought for a moment it was a ghost, not herself, and she let out a loud scream that echoed through the empty space. Her scream brought footsteps running, and Jane banged on the door, begging to be let out, shouting, "Please, I'll be good." But her fear kept building until she felt dizzy and couldn't breathe, and then everything went dark as she fainted, collapsing on the floor from the terror. When she woke up, she wasn't in the Red Room anymore. The servants had carried her to her own bed, and Bessie was there, looking worried, while a kind doctor named Mr. Lloyd checked on her. Jane told him about the Red Room and how scared she'd been, and for once, someone listened to her story, which felt like a small comfort, even though it didn't change her life at Gateshead. Later, Mr. Lloyd spoke to Mrs. Reed, explaining that Jane wasn't happy and that staying in such an unkind place might make her sick. He suggested sending her to school, which Mrs. Reed didn't like at first, because she didn't want to spend money on Jane or let her have a chance at something better. But after thinking it over, she realized that if Jane left, she wouldn't have to see her anymore or deal with the girl she disliked so much, so she agreed to the plan. Jane overheard this and felt both scared and excited. Leaving Gateshead was a big step into the unknown, but it might also mean a chance to escape the pain she'd known for so long. A few weeks went by, and Jane got ready to leave, with Bessie helping her pack her few belongings, like some plain clothes and a small bag, since she didn't own much. One day, Mrs. Reed called Jane to her room for a talk before she left, and Jane hoped her aunt might say something kind or even apologize for all the hard times. Instead, Mrs. Reed looked at her coldly and said, "I've done my duty by taking you in, but you're a difficult child, and I'll be glad when you're gone." Those words hurt Jane deeply, but she held back her tears, deciding she wouldn't let Mrs. Reed see her break down anymore. The next morning, a carriage came to take Jane away, and as she climbed inside, her hands were trembling with nerves. Bessie surprised her with a quick hug, the first real kindness Jane had felt at Gateshead, which made her feel a little less alone. As the carriage rolled away, Jane looked back at the big house until it faded from sight, leaving her with a strange mix of sadness for the only home she'd known and hope for what might come next. The road stretched out long and dark ahead of her, and though she was just a small girl facing it alone, something inside her whispered that she could be strong enough to keep going, no matter what lay in store. So, Jane's time at Gateshead came to an end, and she set off for Lowood School, a new place that would bring different challenges and people into her life. Her childhood had been filled with tears and fear, but it had also taught her to be brave, setting the stage for everything that would happen next in her journey. Part 2: Lowood School and Education. Jane arrives at Lowood School after a long, cold journey in a carriage from Gateshead, feeling nervous but hopeful that this new place might be better than the home she left. She's still just 10 years old, a small girl with no family, and when she steps into Lowood, she finds it's a big, plain building that looks serious and unwelcoming. This isn't a fancy school. It's a charity institution for poor girls like Jane, run by strict rules and meant to teach them to be humble and hardworking. The first thing she notices is how cold it is, with stone floors and thin walls that let the wind whistle through, and she wonders if she'll ever feel warm or safe here. Life at Lowood starts hard for Jane because the rules are tough and there's not much to eat or wear to keep the girls comfortable. She wakes up early every morning to bells ringing, puts on a simple brown dress that all the students wear, and lines up with the others for a breakfast that's usually just watery porridge or burnt bread. The teachers watch over them closely, and one man, Mr. Brocklehurst, is in charge of everything. He's tall and thin, with a sharp voice, and he believes the girls should live with almost nothing to make them good and obedient. Jane doesn't like him from the start, especially when he talks about punishing them to save their souls, which makes her feel small and scared all over again. But then something good happens. Jane meets a girl named Helen Burns, who becomes her first real friend. Helen is a little older, with dark hair and a quiet way about her, and she's kind to Jane even though they've just met. They sit together in class where they learn reading, writing, and sewing, and Helen helps Jane feel less alone by talking to her about books and ideas. While Jane often feels angry about how unfair life is, Helen is different. She accepts the hard things with patience and says they'll have a better life one day, maybe in heaven. Jane doesn't always understand Helen's calm attitude, but she loves having someone who cares about her, and their friendship grows stronger every day. Things at Lowood aren't easy, though, and one day, Mr. Brocklehurst shows just how cruel he can be. He comes to the school with his fancy wife and daughters, who wear bright dresses and hats with feathers, looking so rich compared to the cold, hungry girls in their plain uniforms. He calls Jane out in front of everyone, saying she's a liar because Mrs. Reed told him so before Jane left Gateshead. Jane's face burns with shame as all the girls and teachers stare at her, and she wants to run away or shout that it's not true, but she stays quiet, too afraid to speak. Mr. Brocklehurst tells everyone to stay away from her, leaving Jane feeling more alone than ever, like she'll never escape the pain of being unwanted. Luckily, not everyone believes Mr. Brocklehurst, and a kind teacher named Miss Temple steps in to help. She's gentle and fair, with a soft voice that makes Jane feel safe. And after the scene with Mr. Brocklehurst, she calls Jane to her room to talk. Jane tells her the truth about Gateshead, how Mrs. Reed and her cousins treated her badly, and Miss Temple listens carefully, her eyes full of understanding. She believes Jane and even writes to someone to check her story, which turns out to be true. After that, Miss Temple tells the school Jane isn't a liar, and though it doesn't fix everything, it lifts a weight off Jane's heart, giving her a little hope that maybe Lowood won't always be so bad. But then a terrible time comes to Lowood, when spring arrives and brings sickness with it. The damp, cold building and the poor food make many girls fall ill with typhus, a fever that spreads fast and leaves them weak and coughing. Jane watches as beds empty out around her, with girls taken away to a hospital or dying quietly in the night, and she's scared she might get sick too. One day, Helen starts feeling unwell, but it's not typhus, it's something slower, a sickness in her lungs that's been there for a while. Jane finds her in a small room, lying in bed, her face pale but peaceful, and she climbs in beside her, holding her friend close because she doesn't want to lose her. That night, Jane falls asleep next to Helen, feeling her friend's quiet breathing, but when she wakes up in the morning, Helen is gone. She's died in the night, slipping away without a sound. Jane's heart breaks as she realizes her best friend is lost forever, and she cries for days, missing Helen's kindness and the way she made Lowood bearable. The teachers find them together and bury Helen in a little graveyard nearby, and Jane feels the emptiness of being alone again, wondering how she'll go on without her. But Helen's death changes things at Lowood. People hear about the sickness, and soon kinder men take over, fixing the school so it's not so harsh anymore, with better food and warmer rooms. Time passes after that, and Jane stays at Lowood for 8 years, growing from a scared little girl into a young woman who's stronger than she ever thought she could be. She spends 6 years as a student, learning more about books and the world, and then 2 years as a teacher, helping the younger girls the way Miss Temple once helped her. The school becomes a quieter place, with less fear and more order, and Jane finds some peace in her work, even though her heart still aches for Helen sometimes. But as she turns 18, she starts to feel restless, like there's something more waiting for her outside those stone walls, something bigger than the life she's known. One day, Jane sits by the window, looking out at the fields beyond Lowood, and decides she can't stay forever. She wants to see the world, to find a new purpose, and though she's grateful for what the school gave her, a chance to learn and grow, she knows it's time to move on. So, she writes an advertisement, offering to work as a governess, someone who teaches children in their homes, and sends it out, hoping someone will answer. Not long after, a letter comes from a place called Thornfield Hall, where a woman named Mrs. Fairfax needs a teacher for a little girl. Jane's heart jumps with excitement. She's never been anywhere but Gateshead and Lowood, and now a new adventure is calling her. Before she leaves, Jane says goodbye to Lowood, walking past Helen's grave one last time, where the grass has grown over the stone, and she whispers a quiet thank you for the friend who helped her through the darkest days. Then she packs her small bag, puts on her plain coat, and steps into a carriage, feeling both nervous and ready for whatever comes next. As Lowood fades behind her, Jane knows she's leaving behind years of struggle and sadness, but also the place that made her brave and taught her to stand up for herself. The road to Thornfield stretches out ahead, and though she's still young and alone, she's starting to believe she can face anything. So Jane's time at Lowood ends, and she heads toward Thornfield Hall, a new chapter waiting to begin. Her years at school were full of hardship, loss, and quiet strength, shaping her into someone ready to take on the world, one step at a time. Part 3. Arrival at Thornfield and meeting Rochester. Jane leaves Lowood School at 18, excited but a little nervous because she's never been anywhere else except Gateshead and the school she's known for 8 years. She's answered an advertisement to work as a governess, and after a long ride in a carriage, she arrives at Thornfield Hall one chilly October evening. The house is big and old, with tall walls and dark windows, and when Jane steps inside, she's greeted by Mrs. Fairfax, a kind older woman who manages the place. Mrs. Fairfax smiles warmly and shows Jane around, explaining that she'll be teaching a little girl named Adele, the ward of the house's owner, Mr. Rochester. Jane feels a rush of relief. Thornfield seems quieter and friendlier than Lowood, and she hopes this could be a fresh start. The next day, Jane meets Adele, a lively girl with curly hair who loves to sing and dance. And though she speaks mostly French, Jane likes her right away. Adele tells Jane she's from France, where she lived with her mother before coming to Thornfield, and now Mr. Rochester takes care of her, even though he's often away. Jane's job is to teach her reading, writing, and a bit of English, and she settles into a routine, spending her days in the schoolroom with Adele and her evenings talking with Mrs. Fairfax by the fire. The house feels peaceful at first, with its warm rooms and soft carpets, and Jane starts to enjoy her work, feeling useful and needed in a way she never did before. But as the weeks go by, Jane notices something strange about Thornfield, something that makes her curious and a little uneasy. One night, she's lying in bed when she hears a wild laugh echoing through the halls, a sound so loud and odd that it sends shivers down her spine. She sits up, listening hard, wondering if it's the wind or maybe a servant, but it doesn't sound like anything normal. The next morning, she asks Mrs. Fairfax about it, hoping for an answer that will calm her nerves. But the older woman just smiles and says it's probably Grace Poole, a quiet servant who works upstairs. Jane isn't sure she believes that. The laugh was too wild for one person, but she lets it go, though the mystery stays in her mind. Then, one day, everything changes when Jane meets Mr. Rochester, the man who owns Thornfield. She's walking along a quiet road near the house, enjoying the fresh air, when a horse comes galloping toward her, its rider tall and dark against the evening sky. The horse slips on some ice, and the man falls, cursing loudly as he hits the ground. Jane runs over to help, offering her hand, and when he looks up, she sees a strong face with heavy eyebrows and deep eyes that seem to study her. He's not young or handsome in a soft way, but there's something about him that catches her attention, something bold and alive. He asks her who she is, and she tells him she's the governess from Thornfield, which makes him nod because he's Mr. Rochester himself. Back at the house, Jane helps him inside since he's hurt his ankle, and they talk for the first time, sitting by the fire while Adele plays nearby. Mr. Rochester is different from anyone Jane has ever met. He speaks sharply, asks her questions about her life, and doesn't treat her like she's just a servant. She tells him about Gateshead and Lowood, keeping her voice steady even though her past still hurts, and he listens, sometimes smiling in a way that's hard to read. Jane feels nervous, but also drawn to him because he's not afraid to say what he thinks, and he seems interested in her, not just her job. That night, she goes to bed thinking about him, her heart beating a little faster than usual. From then on, Mr. Rochester is around more often, and Jane starts to see him almost every day, usually in the evenings when he calls her to the drawing room. They sit together, talking about all kinds of things, books, the world, his travels. And though he can be moody or quiet sometimes, Jane likes how he treats her like an equal. One evening, he tells her about Adele's mother, a French dancer he once knew, and how he took Adele in after the woman died, even though he's not her real father. Jane listens, feeling a mix of surprise and respect, because he's opening up to her in a way she didn't expect, and it makes her feel closer to him. But the strange things at Thornfield don't stop, and one night, something scary happens that pulls Jane even deeper into the mystery. She's asleep when a sharp smell wakes her up, smoke, and she hears that wild laugh again, louder than before. She jumps out of bed, her heart racing, and follows the sound down the hall until she reaches Mr. Rochester's room, where flames are climbing the curtains and his bed is starting to burn. Without thinking, she grabs a jug of water from the table and throws it on the fire, shouting for him to wake up as the smoke stings her eyes. Mr. Rochester leaps up, confused but alive, and together they put out the flames, soaking the room with more water until the danger is gone. When it's over, they stand there, breathing hard, and Mr. Rochester looks at Jane with something new in his eyes. Gratitude, maybe, or something stronger. He asks her how she knew to come, and she tells him about the laugh and the smoke, her voice shaking from the shock. Instead of explaining, he just takes her hand and holds it tight, thanking her for saving his life, and Jane feels a warmth she can't name spreading through her. He tells her to go back to bed, but says not to tell anyone what happened, which leaves her puzzled. As she walks away, she hears him call Grace Poole's name upstairs, and though she doesn't understand why, she trusts him enough to keep quiet. After that night, Jane can't stop thinking about Mr. Rochester, and her feelings start to grow, even though she tries to push them down. They keep meeting, talking late into the evening, and every time she feels more drawn to him, like he's someone who sees her for who she really is. He teases her sometimes, calling her a little bird or asking why she's so serious, but there's kindness in his voice that makes her smile. Jane knows he's older and richer, someone far above her in the world, but when they're together, those differences seem to fade, and she starts to imagine what it would be like to stay with him forever. Still, the strange laugh and the fire linger in her thoughts, and Jane can't shake the feeling that Thornfield is hiding something big. She watches Grace Poole sometimes, a plain woman who sews quietly upstairs, but she doesn't seem like someone who'd start a fire or laugh like a wild animal. Mrs. Fairfax keeps saying it's nothing to worry about, but Jane's curiosity grows stronger, and so does her worry. She loves her life at Thornfield, teaching Adele, talking with Mr. Rochester, but there's a shadow over it all, a secret she can't see yet. So, Jane settles into Thornfield, her days full of work and her nights full of new feelings, while the house around her hums with mystery. She's found a place that feels almost like home, and a man who makes her heart beat faster. But the strange sounds and the fire are just the beginning of what's to come. Part 4. Love, Deception, and the Wedding. Jane has been at Thornfield for months now, teaching Adele and spending evenings talking with Mr. Rochester, and her feelings for him have grown deeper than she ever thought possible. She tries to hide it at first, telling herself he's her employer and so much older, but every time they sit by the fire, laughing or sharing stories, her heart feels warm and full. One day, something big happens. Mr. Rochester brings guests to Thornfield, fancy people like the beautiful Blanche Ingram, who flirts with him and makes Jane feel small and plain. Jane watches them together, her stomach twisting with jealousy, thinking he might marry Blanche because she's rich and lovely, everything Jane believes she's not. But then, one evening, Mr. Rochester surprises her completely, calling her to the garden where the air smells of flowers and the stars are shining bright. He looks at her with those deep eyes and says he doesn't care about Blanche or anyone else. He loves Jane, just as she is, and he wants her to be his wife. Jane's heart stops for a moment because she can't believe it's true, and she asks him if he's serious, her voice shaking with hope. He promises he means every word, telling her she's the only one who makes him feel alive. And though Jane worries about their differences, her being poor and him so grand, she says yes, because she loves him too, more than she can say. The next few weeks are like a dream for Jane, full of joy and plans for their wedding, and even the strange laughs from upstairs can't take away her happiness. Mr. Rochester buys her a white dress and a veil, and though she feels shy about all the fuss, she lets herself imagine a life with him, a home where she's loved and wanted. Mrs. Fairfax watches it all with a quiet smile, but sometimes her eyes look worried, like she knows something Jane doesn't. Jane brushes it off, too caught up in her excitement, and every night she goes to bed with a smile, counting the days until she'll be Mrs. Rochester. But the night before the wedding, something eerie happens that shakes Jane's calm. She's sleeping when a bad dream wakes her up, a vision of Thornfield in ruins, with her running away holding a baby, and her heart is pounding as she opens her eyes. Then she hears a noise, soft at first, and sees a tall, strange woman in her room, her face hidden in the shadows. The woman takes Jane's wedding veil, puts it on, and stares into the mirror before ripping it apart with a horrible laugh, the same wild sound Jane has heard before. Jane screams, terrified, and the figure runs out, leaving her trembling in bed, wondering if it was real or just her imagination. The next morning, Jane tells Mr. Rochester about the dream and the woman, her voice shaky as she describes the torn veil, and though he looks upset, he hugs her tight and says it was just a nightmare, nothing to worry about. He promises the wedding will go ahead, and Jane trusts him, letting his words calm her fears, even though a tiny part of her still feels uneasy. They head to the church together, Jane in her simple white dress, her hands cold with nerves, but her heart full of love, ready to start this new life with the man she adores. At the church, everything feels perfect at first. The sun is shining, the priest is waiting, and Jane stands beside Mr. Rochester, ready to say her vows. But just as the priest asks if anyone knows a reason they can't marry, a voice shouts from the back, loud and clear, stopping everything. A man steps forward, Mr. Mason, who says he's from far away, and he declares that Mr. Rochester can't marry Jane because he's already married, to a woman named Bertha Mason, who's still alive. Jane's world spins, her breath catching in her chest as she looks at Mr. Rochester, hoping it's a lie, but his face turns pale, and she knows it's true. The church falls silent, everyone staring, and Mr. Rochester doesn't deny it. He grabs Jane's hand and says they're going back to Thornfield, his voice rough with anger and pain. When they get there, he leads her and the others up to the attic, a part of the house Jane has never seen, and unlocks a door to show them a wild, shouting woman with tangled hair and burning eyes, Bertha Mason, his wife. Jane stares, her heart breaking, as Mr. Rochester explains that he married Bertha years ago in Jamaica, tricked into it by her family, who hid her madness until it was too late. She got worse over time, turning violent, and he locked her here with Grace Poole to watch her, because he couldn't bear to send her away or let people know. Jane listens, tears stinging her eyes, as he tells her how trapped he's felt, how meeting her gave him hope again, and he begs her to stay with him, saying Bertha isn't really his wife anymore, not in his heart. But Jane can't speak. Her mind is racing, full of shock and hurt, because the man she loves has kept this huge secret, letting her believe they could be together when he knew it was impossible. She pulls away, her hands shaking, and runs to her room, locking the door, where she sits on the bed, crying into her hands, feeling like everything she dreamed of has crumbled to dust. That night, Jane can't sleep, her thoughts spinning between love and betrayal, and though she still cares for Mr. Rochester, she knows she can't stay with a married man, no matter how much it hurts to leave. She hears him outside her door, calling her name, pleading with her not to go, his voice breaking with sadness. But Jane stays quiet, her heart aching as she decides what to do. Before the sun comes up, she grabs her small bag, the same one she brought from Lowood, and slips out of Thornfield, leaving her wedding dress behind, tears running down her face as she walks away from the only place that ever felt like home. As she steps onto the dark road, Jane feels lost and alone, with no money or plan, just the sound of her own footsteps and the weight of her broken heart. She loves Mr. Rochester, but his lie has torn them apart, and she can't live with someone who hid the truth, even if he's suffering too. The wind blows cold around her, and she shivers, wondering where she'll go, but deep inside, she knows she has to keep moving, because staying would mean losing herself. So, Jane leaves Thornfield behind, her dreams of love shattered by the secret in the attic, and starts a journey into the unknown, carrying nothing but her strength and her pain. The wedding that promised happiness has turned into a nightmare, and now she's alone again, facing a world that feels bigger and scarier than ever. Part 5: Exile and the Rivers Family. Jane walks away from Thornfield in the early morning, her eyes still wet with tears, carrying only a small bag and a few coins she had left from her governess' pay. She's left Mr. Rochester behind, even though she loves him, because she couldn't stay with a man who's already married. no matter how much it hurts to go. With no plan and no one to turn to, she climbs into a coach, using her last money to get as far away as she can. And when the driver drops her off in a quiet, unfamiliar place called Whitcross, she's all alone, surrounded by empty fields and a cold wind that chills her to the bone. For days, Jane wanders the countryside, her stomach growling with hunger and her feet aching from walking because she has no food or shelter to keep her going. She tries knocking on doors, asking for work or a piece of bread, but people turn her away, looking at her plain clothes and tired face with suspicion, and it makes her feel smaller than ever. The nights are the worst. She sleeps under bushes or against stone walls, shivering as the rain soaks through her dress, and she starts to wonder if leaving Thornfield was a mistake, if she'll even survive this loneliness. One stormy evening, she collapses on the wet ground, too weak to move, whispering a prayer for help as her strength fades away. Just when everything seems hopeless, a light flickers in the distance, and Jane drags herself toward it, her legs shaking but her heart lifting with a tiny spark of hope. She reaches a small house called Moore House and peers through the window, seeing two young women sitting by a fire, their faces kind and calm. She knocks on the door, barely able to stand, and when an older servant named Hannah opens it, Jane begs to come in, her voice faint from exhaustion. At first, Hannah hesitates, thinking Jane might be a beggar, but then a man steps out, a tall, serious-looking person named St. John Rivers, who looks at her with steady eyes and decides to let her inside, saving her from the cold night. Inside, Jane sits by the warm fire, her hands trembling as she takes a cup of tea from the two women, Mary and Diana Rivers, who wrap her in a blanket and speak to her gently. They're St. John's sisters, and they treat Jane with a kindness she hasn't felt since Helen Burns, asking her name and where she's from, though Jane's too shaken to tell them everything. She calls herself Jane Elliott instead, afraid to say who she really is after all that's happened. And they don't push her, just give her bread and a bed to sleep in. That night, Jane cries quietly, grateful to be safe but still hurting from the love she left behind, wondering if she'll ever feel whole again. Over the next few weeks, Jane stays with the Rivers family, slowly getting stronger as they feed her and let her rest, and she starts to feel at home in their simple, cozy house. Mary and Diana are warm and funny, always chatting with her about books or the village, and Jane loves their company because it's been so long since she had friends to laugh with. St. John is different. He's quiet and strict, often lost in his own thoughts, but he's kind in his own way. And Jane can tell he's someone who cares about doing good. They figure out she's educated, so St. John offers her a job teaching at a small school he's starting for poor girls in the nearby village of Morton. And Jane says yes, eager to have a purpose again. Teaching keeps Jane busy, and though the school is plain and the girls are shy at first, she likes helping them learn to read and write, feeling useful in a way that reminds her of Lowood. She lives in a little cottage St. John gives her, and life settles into a steady rhythm, with days spent at the school and evenings visiting Moore House, where Mary and Diana make her smile. But even with this new start, Jane's heart still aches for Mr. Rochester. She dreams of him at night, hearing his voice or seeing his face, and it leaves her torn between moving on and holding on to the past. One day, something surprising happens that changes everything for Jane, lifting her out of her quiet life in a way she never expected. St. John comes to her with news. Her uncle, John Eyre, has died far away in Madeira, and because he had no children, he left Jane a fortune of £20,000, more money than she's ever dreamed of. Jane's shocked, her mind racing as she realizes this uncle was her father's brother, someone she never knew, and now she's rich, no longer a poor governess with nothing to her name. Even more amazing, St. John reveals that he, Mary, and Diana are her cousins because their mother was John Eyre's sister, making them family. Jane didn't know she had. Jane's heart swells with joy at finding relatives, and though the money means she'll never have to worry again, what matters most is sharing it with the Rivers, who took her in when she had nothing. She insists on splitting the fortune 4 ways, giving each of them £5,000, and though St. John argues at first, saying she should keep it, Jane won't budge. She wants them to have it, because they've given her a home and love when she needed it most. Mary and Diana hug her, tears in their eyes, and for the first time in years, Jane feels like she belongs somewhere, surrounded by people who care about her. But even with this happiness, Jane's life takes another turn when St. John starts to see her in a new way, asking her to marry him and go with him to India, where he plans to work as a missionary. He doesn't love her like Mr. Rochester did. He says it's about duty, about serving God together. And though Jane respects him, her heart says no, because she can't marry someone she doesn't love, no matter how good his reasons are. She tells him she'll go as his helper, not his wife. But St. John gets cold and distant, pushing her to agree, and it makes Jane feel trapped, like she's losing her freedom again. One night, as she's wrestling with this choice, something strange and wonderful happens. Jane hears Mr. Rochester's voice calling her name, clear and loud, even though he's miles away. She runs outside, looking into the dark, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and longing. And though no one's there, she knows it's real, a sign that he needs her. The next day, she tells St. John she can't go to India. She has to find Mr. Rochester to see if he's safe and what's happened since she left. She packs her things, her hands steady with purpose, and says goodbye to Mary and Diana, who hug her tight and wish her well, understanding her need to follow her heart. So Jane leaves Morehouse, her pockets full of money and her spirit lifted by family, but driven by a pull she can't ignore. Her time in exile has tested her, brought her low, and then raised her up, and now she's ready to face whatever comes next, hoping to find the man she still loves. Part 6, Reunion and Resolution. Jane travels back to Thornfield Hall, her heart beating fast with hope and worry because she hasn't seen Mr. Rochester in over a year, not since she left him after learning about his secret wife. She's richer now, thanks to her uncle's inheritance, and stronger too after surviving on her own. But all she can think about is finding him, wondering if he's safe and if he still cares for her. When she finally reaches the place where Thornfield should be, her breath catches in her chest. What she sees isn't the grand house she remembers, but a pile of burnt stones and broken walls, blackened by fire and left in ruins. She stares, her eyes wide with shock, feeling like the ground has dropped out from under her. A man at a nearby inn tells her what happened, and Jane listens, her hands trembling as the story unfolds. Months ago, Bertha Mason, Mr. Rochester's mad wife, set fire to Thornfield one night, burning it down while everyone slept, her wild laughter echoing through the flames. Mr. Rochester tried to save her, climbing to the attic to pull her out, but she jumped from the roof, dying on the stones below. And in the chaos, he was hurt badly, losing his sight and one hand as the house collapsed around him. Jane's heart aches hearing this, picturing him trapped and alone. And when the man says Mr. Rochester now lives quietly at Ferndean, a small house nearby, she knows she has to go to him, no matter what's changed. The next day, Jane walks to Ferndean, a simple place hidden among trees, her stomach twisting with nerves because she doesn't know what she'll find. She steps inside and sees Mr. Rochester sitting by the fire, his face older and sadder, his eyes staring blankly ahead, blind from the accident. He looks thinner, his strong shoulders bent, and Jane's throat tightens with a mix of love and pain, seeing how much he's suffered since she left. She doesn't say who she is at first, just hands him a glass of water, letting him feel her presence. And when he touches her hand, he freezes, his voice shaking as he whispers her name. "Jane?" She answers softly, "Yes, it's me," and tears spill down her cheeks because she's finally with him again. Mr. Rochester pulls her close, his arms trembling as he holds her, and asks where she's been, his words rough with emotion because he thought he'd lost her forever. Jane tells him everything, how she ran away, wandered hungry and lost, found the Rivers family, and came back when she heard his voice calling her across the miles, a moment so real it brought her here. He listens, his blind eyes wet with tears, and says he's been broken since she left, living in darkness and regret, wishing every day she'd come back to him. Jane's heart swells because even after all the lies and pain, she still loves him, and now that Bertha's gone, there's nothing standing between them. They sit together for hours, talking by the fire, and though Mr. Rochester worries he's not the man he was, blind and hurt, with no grand house to offer, Jane stops him, saying she doesn't care about that, only about being with him. She tells him she's rich now, with money from her uncle, and they can build a new life together, equal in a way they couldn't be before. He smiles, a small, real smile, and asks her to marry him again, not as a secret this time, but as his true wife. And Jane says yes, her voice steady with joy, because this is what she's wanted all along, a love that's honest and hers. A few weeks later, they marry in a quiet little church, just the two of them with a priest. No fancy guests or big dresses, and Jane feels happier than she ever has, standing beside him with her hand in his. They move into Ferndean, a cozy house that's nothing like Thornfield, but it's warm and theirs, filled with the sound of their voices and Adele's laughter when she visits from school, where Jane sent her to learn and grow. Mr. Rochester leans on Jane more now, letting her guide him through the rooms, and though he can't see her face, he traces it with his fingers, telling her she's his light, the one thing that keeps him going. Life settles into a peaceful rhythm, and Jane finds a kind of happiness she never knew at Gateshead or Lowood, a happiness that comes from being loved and loving someone back. Mr. Rochester's sight starts to come back a little over time. One eye clears enough to see shapes and colors, and when their first child is born, a boy with dark hair like his father's, he holds him close, tears in his eyes because he can just make out his tiny face. Jane watches them, her heart full, knowing she's built something real, a family that's hers after years of being alone. Years pass, and Jane looks back on her life, telling her story with a quiet smile, because she's come so far from the little girl who cried at Gateshead. She writes about Mr. Rochester, how they've been married 10 years now, happier every day, and how he's strong again, walking with her through the woods around Ferndean, their hands locked together. She mentions St. John Rivers, too, who went to India alone and works hard there, sending letters sometimes. And though Jane's glad for her cousins, she knows her place is here, with the man she fought so hard to love. As she finishes her tale, Jane thinks about all the pain she faced, the cold nights, the lost dreams, the times she almost gave up, and how it led her to this moment, sitting by the fire with Mr. Rochester, their son, asleep upstairs. She's not just an orphan anymore, not a governess or a wanderer. She's a wife, a mother, a woman who found her way through the dark to a life that's bright and true. The wind blows outside, but inside it's warm, and Jane rests her head on Mr. Rochester's shoulder, feeling safe and whole at last. So Jane's story ends at Ferndean, a place of reunion and peace after years of struggle, where love wins out over secrets and loss. She's faced everything life threw at her, loneliness, betrayal, exile, and come through it stronger, holding tight to the happiness she earned with every step.